So I'm Bronwyn Williams and we're back at the small print, and today my guest is Ronak Gopaldas, who I'm going to hand over to introduce himself the way you would like to be introduced.
Thanks, Bronwyn. Good to be with you. I write, speak, and think for a living. My focus is primarily global geopolitics and how it relates to the African continent. In my former life, I was an investment banker. Now I kind of look at themes and trends across the continent, I guess a little bit similar to what you do. And it's a lot of fun. Prior to the pandemic, I used to travel a lot. Now I travel to Cape Town. Generally that's what I do, kind of look at interesting themes and trends and try to make sense of the world and the continent at large.
And that's exactly why we're speaking to you today, about trying to make sense about what is going on in the world. And in particular, we want to look at how this whole shift that's taken place with the pandemic has really shaken up geopolitics, but particularly for the African continent. It's opened up some new opportunities and some new threats. So do you have a comment on that? Generally speaking, what are the big macro trends you're seeing that we're heading into in 2021 that African leaders and the political sphere and in the corporate sphere are going to have to be keeping an eye on right now?
So I think we need to start by kind of looking at the global backdrop and what's happened in that context. So I think we are seeing a seminal shift in what's happening globally. We've moved from the era kind of after the fall of the Berlin Wall, where we had the Washington Consensus, where globalization, democratization, and capitalism were the dominant kind of themes, and that was the only show in town for a long time. That was punctuated in 2008 by the global financial crisis, which led to populist impulses. You had monetary easing and fiscal austerity, which gave rise to strongman politics and populist elements rising on both the left and the right of the political spectrum. Now we've kind of had a public health emergency, which has required a big interventionist response from the state. So we are now kind of almost entering an era of big government, big debt, and big spending. And I think we've moved very far away from that neoliberal kind of idea of the Washington Consensus to an era where the role, the relevance, and the reach of the state is far greater. And I think Africa is not immune to these trends. So I think we've got a very interesting dynamic at play over here, where you've effectively got the paradox of the state, because on the one hand, you're saying that you are going to be seeing a much more interventionist, much more muscular, much more robust state. On the other hand, you look at many countries on the continent and you see the state as being a critical part of the problem, an inhibitor to economic growth and a real constraint. So I think this is the realization that we have to kind of get to grips with, is that the state is both part of the solution and the problem. And how we navigate the state's relationships with international creditors and international superpowers in an African context is going to be quite important to observe.
Yeah, I think it's a great opening point, that whole shift from the older consensus towards that new consensus with the much bigger governments, much more interventionist governments. It really is one of those big trends that we have to take cognizance of. However, we can unpack that a little bit, in that there's quite a big difference between a big weak state and a big strong state, and a big good state and a big bad state. So I think there's sort of like those three sort of layers that you have to unpack. And the African challenge is obviously quite different to, say, the American challenge or the Asian challenge or the European challenge, in that we are headed towards having bigger states across Africa, but also weak states. So I think Nigeria is a great case in point right there. You've got a big government, it's quite powerful, but it's not that powerful. It's powerful in sort of principle, but not in practice. It's not able to enforce its ideas using law and order and all those sort of channels that perhaps other stronger states are able to do, like looking at, of course, your two sort of polar opposite powers, your United States and your China. They are able to shape the world in their own image and have the means to do this. What are your thoughts on that? Just unpacking that first sort of lever that is important there, that idea of the strength of the state. Are African states in general, or in specific, if you want to pick on a couple of them, actually strong enough in order to be big states and to change the world into their own image?
At the moment, the short answer is no. And I'd add, in addition to kind of the strength of the state, the legitimacy of the state. And we know that trust is declining in democracy. We're seeing in many countries democracy is regressing. You're seeing through physical autocracy and digital autocracy, a lot of the gains are being eroded. You look at the Mo Ibrahim governance index. From the first time in a decade, Africa has kind of slipped as a continent in general on those indicators. So, I think the pandemic has exposed a lot of the glaring weaknesses in terms of governance, in terms of economic mismanagement. And it really kind of poses a big question mark around the role in the state and its responsibilities going forward. As we know, demographics are a really, really big factor. We are going to have the largest population in the world by 2050. 1 in 4 people in the world are going to be from Africa. If these young people don't have jobs, if they're not able to meaningfully participate in the economy, then they look for things outside of the formal economic structures and your conventional approaches. And that's where things like organized crime and these kind of activities become more attractive, when there are crises of legitimacy, when there are power vacuums, and when you've got multiple factors which exacerbate conflict. So I think these are obviously very concerning trends, but there are opportunities as well. But again, I think the way the African state, which is going to be front and center in this new era, navigates its relationships with international creditors, international powers, its citizens, non-state actors, and the private sector and the business community, I think are going to be fundamental to determining whether we succeed or fail.
Yes, I know that we've both written a bit about this whole issue going forward. And the big challenge for African governments and African leaders in the public and private sector is this whole concept of having sort of first world tastes, but third world budgets, or developed world expectations, but developing world ability to deliver. So we kind of caught in this world where we are over-promising, but we are under-delivering, where we are committing to big state spending, but we just simply don't have the ability to actually make those plans into fruition, to get those money multipliers, to get the economies actually growing again. And this is quite a dangerous place to be in from, and of course, a vicious and virtuous cycle and circle point of view, but also from a political and economic stability point of view. So if we are sort of over-promising with moonshots and all those fantastic development states, new green deals, all these great big ideas, if we are unable to execute them properly, we end up, of course, with sort of a worse problem than what we started with, both economically speaking and politically speaking again, because that just erodes trust and legitimacy in the states. So that's kind of like the macro problem context that we are looking at here. But add the pandemic in, and we've got some even more sort of specific challenges that are coming out there. Do you want to unpack that a little bit, or should I interrogate you a bit deeper with more specific questions?
Yeah, I think there's loads of challenges that you can wrestle with. I think obviously Africa is the poorest continent in the world. There's no secret about that. And I think what we've seen through the pandemic is that we had a trifecta of issues that came to the fore. We had a commodity price decline. We had capital flight, which elevated the cost of funding. And then we, of course, had COVID, which magnified the governance challenges. And a lot of the countries that were affected already had very narrow revenue lines, very weak balance sheets, and were mismanaging their economies anyway. And an example that stands out is Zambia, which was in crisis even before the crisis, and this was simply a kick in the teeth. So very much a perfect storm, a confluence of factors which led to the continent experiencing its first recession in 25 years, according to the IMF. So that was a real kind of setback for the continent, but there are green shoots of recovery at the moment. The African Development Bank is forecasting a growth rate of 3% for the continent this year. We've seen commodity prices ticking up nicely. Copper's at an 8-year high. Oil is up over 300% since its lows in April last year. LNG is up as well. So that's a boost. In addition to that, financial markets are being injected with huge monetary stimulus and fiscal stimulus, which is creating kind of risk-on environment. Investor sentiment seems to be on the up. Overlay this with potentially lower trade tensions between the US and China, the commodity recovery. And this kind of bodes well for recovery, but this is obviously very contingent on the vaccine economic story. And as we know, we're lagging behind as a continent quite significantly relative to the rest of the world. So we cannot afford to be a laggard. And I think the execution of the vaccine strategy is going to determine whether we can actually benefit from this recovery or not. The other point to bear in mind, I think from an economic perspective, is that we've been here before. So at the turn of the last decade, there was this whole Africa Rising narrative. It was very superficial, but we squandered the opportunity. So, we kind of had bad economics and bad politics, and we should have capitalized on the windfall, and we didn't do that. Now it kind of seems like we've got this get out of jail free card again. We should really learn from the mistakes that we made in the past and make sure that we don't squander these benefits this time around.
Yeah, so let's talk about that, as you call it, that get out of jail free card. So obviously we've sort of contextualized formulated the kind of mess that we're in right now. And that opportunity is the fact that there's a whole lot of liquidity slushing around looking for yield right now. And quite frankly, most of the world has run out of ideas to the point that we're investing in things like GIFs, because that's the best place to get yield right now. So how does Africa become part of that sort of that capital looking for something to invest in story? What does Africa have to present, and how does Africa have to present it so that international investors who suddenly have their fantastic stimulus checks, and bankers and big tech companies and VC firms who are just absolutely awash with capital are going to start looking at us rather than at sort of virtual goods economies, because that's where the low-lying fruit is. And I think this is an interesting angle to just unpack a bit, because you've even got companies like Tesla who would rather put their capital into Bitcoin than into investing in real-world businesses. So that should give us a pause for thought on just how broad this get-out-of-jail-free card really is, and what we have to do to change that, to get the big capital investing in real problems and real businesses where we can offer real growth on our side of the world, rather than on the sort of virtual goods which are offering a different kind of very easy come, easy go, low-lying fruit story. So do you have a comment on that and how we can change that story to become part of that story, or are we going to miss this boat?
So I think, from a financial markets perspective, at the moment, we don't really need to do much, quite frankly, because the kind of, the global economy is awash with liquidity. And I think that's kind of playing out, in the same week that you had Zambia defaulting on its Eurobond last year, Cote d'Ivoire, after its election, put away a Eurobond, which was 5 times oversubscribed at a yield of less than 6%. So, from an investor perspective, it depends on which way you look at it. If you're cynical, you say that these guys are being greedy. If you are less cynical, you'll say that they're being nuanced, discretionary investors who are differentiating, and Africa's not a country. So I think, from that perspective, it's quite simple. Our growth rates are far more attractive than the rest of the world. What investors want, though, is policy consistency, credibility, and coherence. And I think we often shoot ourselves in the foot by putting across mixed messaging, clumsy policy own goals, political instability is something that concerns investors. And perhaps there is an African risk premium because investors don't properly understand these markets. But I think in the current conditions, we are likely to see countries that make sure that their houses are in order domestically, that follow sensible policies, are going to be beneficiaries. And I think Egypt stands out as an example over there. Egypt, in the height of the pandemic in May last year, put away a Eurobond 4 times oversubscribed at a very attractive rate. It's following kind of IMF prescriptions and policy protocols, and it's being rewarded by investors. So I think, from a financial market perspective, what investors want is quite simple, and African policymakers know the rules of the game and would do well to kind of to play the game pragmatically. I think looking at trade and investment, this is where the Continental Free Trade Agreement becomes really, really interesting. I think any investor worth their salt will realize that given the size and the scale of what the Continental Free Trade Agreement offers, it's simply too big to ignore. It's a market bigger than that of India, over 1.3 billion people, economy the size of $3.4 trillion US, it's going to be big if we pull it off. So I think, that becomes very attractive. And I think, the pandemic has also accelerated a couple of trends. Localization and digitalization are two trends in particular that have come to the fore, and they fall nicely within what the Continental Free Trade Agreement is trying to achieve. And I think this should be the wake-up call for the continent's policymakers, its civil society, and its private sector, that given what we're seeing with isolationist tendencies, with more nationalism, with border closures, Africa really needs to kind of focus on homegrown solutions and really bet on itself. So hopefully this will be the stimulus that we need to catalyze this regional integration project. As we know, regional trade is abysmal at less than 15% at the moment. The cost and the ease of doing business leaves a lot to be desired. So I think, if this is a kind of stimulus to foster regional integration, that would be great. And again, that creates a virtuous circle, because investors suddenly have bigger markets, more integrated markets to tap into. As we know, we've got a young population which can play a significant role in global production and consumption. And I think, this is the only continent rather that's not fully industrialized. So that creates significant opportunity as well. So I think the investment case is quite apparent. Of course, it's not without risk, but this is I guess what makes it interesting, the risk reward paradigm.
Yeah, interesting Freudian slip right there when you're talking about Africa as a country versus as a continent, because that's the great irony here when you start talking about the free trade agreement, in that we've been railing against this idea of Africa being a country and saying, no, it's actually many different countries. But at the same time, the free trade agreement is perhaps the biggest opportunity to actually get the continent acting more like a single bloc going forward, bringing a bit more geopolitical clout to the table, because a fragmented economy is not going to help us to compete in a balkanized, regionalized world where the different big powers, the big economic and political powers, are forming very, very powerful alliances. Africa is going to have to decide to work with itself, but it's also going to have to decide to work with different formulations of these regional blocs that are emerging. So do you have a comment there on what the opportunity is, and perhaps what some of those less opportunities, or more like threats, that are arising as the world sort of reconfigures into different blocks, as you've got new partnerships making and breaking in the East, as you've of course got a wildcard USA that's not providing the same sort of continuity that it has for the last century? And what is Africa's role in that? Does Africa face a choice or not?
So that's a great question, because I think we are seeing kind of huge disruptions, changes. There's a new game of geopolitical chess occurring globally, and Africa is a significant theater for competition. I think the big question mark is, are we going to be victims or are we going to be victors in this equation? And that's really going to depend on whether we play the game with pragmatism rather than ideology, whether we're smart about how we do this, and whether we exercise agency. So I think that is really the crux of the matter over here, and how we slice and dice the kind of power dynamics in our favor using economic diplomacy. I think is how we can benefit. I think you're quite right. The success is going to come down to whether we can negotiate as a collective. Africa's power is as a collective. That's when things like its population size, its natural resources, its consumption, power, and its human capital power all become really relevant. I think otherwise you're, like you said, a collection of fragmented states, each with disparate interests. So given where we are and how far behind we are the rest of the world, we need to realize that the only shot we have in terms of asserting ourselves on a global stage is by operating as a collective. And again, this is where the Continental Free Trade Agreement is an opportunity, even though it's aspirational, to kind of forge these interests into a broad collective vision, where even if we don't get there immediately, it gives us something to work towards. I think what's also really interesting is that we're seeing the contours kind of shaping differently with established superpowers and as well as emerging superpowers. So, I mean, for the past few years, the West has really been preoccupied with its domestic issues. You've had Make America Great Again under the Trump administration, America First, that isolationist policy. And there was a policy of really benign neglect for a while towards the continent, or belatedly, it was framed in competition with Russia and China. I think that's changing under Biden administration. You're getting a more multipolar kind of world, but where Africa features in terms of the priority list for this administration, which has got its hands full with domestic issues, is going to be quite interesting. But I think they are realizing that they've got a role to play on the global stage, which is a big step change from where we were previously. China, as we know, is very actively engaged on the African continent, mostly through the Belt and Road Initiative. Massive infrastructure project. China's lending is typically in the form of cash for infrastructure or cash for resources. It's come under a bit of criticism of late, largely on account of the xenophobic attacks that occurred in China, debt trap diplomacy allegations, which are contested, and the fact that kind of there is a sense that China might look inward. So that relationship, I think, is still strong and will continue to be that way, particularly in the current context where healthcare diplomacy is a strategy that is really being used by the Chinese to make inroads into the continent or cement their inroads. Then you've got players like Russia, like India coming to the fore as well. Even Turkey, Russia with the Sputnik vaccine is making inroads. Guinea and Algeria have already indicated that they'll be using that vaccine. Russia's been very clever about how it's looked to establish itself on the continent, looking for countries where there's weak legitimacy and their power vacuums, using a combination of hard power and energy diplomacy. I think a lot of people will be familiar with what Wagner has done in the Central African Republic, exploiting the strife over there to really further Russia's interests. And I think Russia realizes that it's not the Soviet Union. It doesn't have the financial or military muscle that it did in the past, but it has been very actively engaged on the continent during the Cold War, and it's looking to really step up these efforts. Similarly, India has aspirations to kind of further its international agenda. The anxiety and the competition that it has with China in the Asian subcontinent has led it to partner up with Japan and launch the Asia-Africa Growth Corridor, which is a digital and maritime initiative which is aimed at countering China's influence. Unlike the Chinese kind of model, it's largely private sector led. It's smaller in quantum, but potentially beneficial for the continent if we can play our cards right. And India, of course, is coming to the party with vaccine goodwill again. And then you've got Turkey, new power without the kind of colonial baggage that many other countries have had. They've got 44 embassies on the continent now. Turkish Airlines travel to 50 plus countries on the continent. You look at the FDI trade and foreign aid numbers from Turkey to Africa, and that really paints a very interesting picture. It's on the rise quite significantly. So there all these new kind of any global power worth its salt realizes that Africa is going to be a critical component of the future. It needs to be very actively engaged. And I think this is creating opportunities. Of course, if we are naive, if we don't manage these partners appropriately, then I think we're going to be on the wrong side of this, and we're going to be exploited as we were during the last Cold War. But I think there really is an opportunity with savvy diplomacy and with clever out-the-box thinking and with a kind of collaborative approach by continental policymakers to really use this to our advantage.
Yeah, so maybe you can unpack a little bit more about what those potential pitfalls are at this point in time, because essentially what you're outlining there is that it's a choice that African leaders, as individuals or as a bloc, depending on how they decide to play this, have to choose who to partner with for the future. And this is quite an interesting question, because we've kind of seen that whole demographic dividend pinball sort of fall from Europe to America, bounce through to Asia, first in China and then India, and now it's going to be Africa's turn. So they've all kind of been there and seen both the pros and the cons of being that sort of epicenter of human growth going on. But from an African perspective, who does it make sense to align with at this point in time? Should we be aligning with someone like India, who's just ahead of us in terms of this demographic dividend curve? Or should we be looking to partner with some of the more aging populations? And there are different things that we can unpack there, because by partnering with more of the Asian powers who are much closer to us in terms of sort of timeline of how these population waves play out, they're also in a sense going to become our competitors. And we've seen this. This is what's happened with China. As it starts to age and India starts to come into its own, that the conflict between those two powers has definitely intensified. So if we are going to sort of look at this from a long game perspective, what is the play that makes most sense for Africans right now? Partnering with the aging sort of West, where they might have more bargaining power in terms of the nice trade between capital and excess labor, it maps out quite nicely, or by partnering with the more sort of energetic, contemporary, emerging superpowers that could end up being competitors a bit further down the line. Do you have any thoughts on that? And of course, contradict me if anything I've said outlining these sort of macro flows doesn't map onto your view of the world.
Yeah, so I think I've got a slightly different take, and I don't think that it needs to be an either or decision. I think there's scope for everyone to be engaged and for us to kind of play nicely with all global powers. And I think that's a function of a horses for courses approach. Given where we are in terms of the development curve, we have multiple needs. You can kind of look to China for rail and road infrastructure, Japan and India for digital and maritime infrastructure, in terms of capacity building, technical assistance, value-based leadership, democracy building. The Europeans are great partners. So I think each country offers some kind of value, but we've got to dictate that agenda. I think also we've got to be quite pragmatic in the way that we do this. As I mentioned, we are very far behind the rest of the world. We're not industrialized, so we need to take smart cuts. So that means that we've got to hack the ladder to success. We can't replicate the ways that have been done in the past, and that's largely because we face a very unique set of circumstances, in the sense that we're facing. We've got to kind of industrialize and democratize simultaneously, but in the context of premature deindustrialization. So this means that we've got to do things in a way that's completely different to the way anyone's done this before. As I mentioned also, if you look at the way Asia industrialized, it was not really under democracy. Democracy was a kind of luxury factor that came a lot later. So it was done under a very autocratic command and control kind of regime. And if you look at the countries that have been successful in making inroads into reducing inequality and fostering inclusive growth, a country like Rwanda stands out. A country like Ethiopia stands out. These were largely command and control economies. So there is a sentiment that democracy is not for Africa, that it hasn't worked, it's an imported construct, and that politics of the stomach requires much more forceful leadership and a far more interventionist approach. So this is where I think in this context, from an aspirational perspective, the Chinese model is quite appealing to African leaders, because they say, look at China, they were poor, they're not poor anymore, they're not a democracy, we can do the same. Unfortunately, the capacity and institutional factors that have driven that and the capacity of the states are very, very different. And I think this is where the West is going to face quite a big existential dilemma, is that the West often puts forward values-based leadership and holds itself to very high standards. China is playing an extremely different game. So the comment that often comes to the fore is that whilst everybody else is playing checkers, China is effectively playing chess. And I think this is going to create a very, very interesting tension for African countries in particular around who to align with, because on the one hand they've got the efficient autocratic Chinese model, which, this pesky thing, democracy, openness, transparency, doesn't need to exist. And I think China is demonstrating that for them. On the other hand, given the creditor matrix and the fact that there are colonial legacies, that they are very dependent on the likes of the US, I think isolating the US and Western partners is going to be very difficult. And I think a lot of the funding is tied to kind of those aspirational goals as well. When it comes from the West, you think of the kind of IMF type programs as a case in point. So I think this is going to create a very, very interesting set of choices for African policymakers to contend with. Is kind of which vision of the future do they align with?
Of course, there's a third way that Africa could present its own vision of the future, because this is the thing. I mean, China has taken its wave and shaped at least a part of the world into its own image. Do you think that's even a possibility at this stage? Is there a will? Is there an appetite? And is there the ability for Africa to design its own vision of the future? And this is something that I look at quite a lot in my own work. I mean, we hear all the wonderful words around Afrofuturism and around this time it's our way, and this is our time, this is our turn, and all those sort of slogans that go around. And we have in the more sort of global context, conversations around the Great Reset and all of these things. Is there a third way? Is there a possibility for Africa to define its own vision for a world order that is not the Western, messy, dog-eat-dog capitalism, but we value liberty and human values and human freedoms and all this on the one hand, or the very efficient but very totalizing vision that sort of Asia offers at this point in time, which gives you sort of economic security, but you trade away then a lot of basic human freedoms and a lot of individualism. And from my perspective, definitely sort of living in Africa my whole life, the African sort of mindset and culture is neither of those things, and perhaps imposing either of those worldviews onto a continent as diverse as Africa might not lead to the same results, if not for ideological reasons, just for simply practical reasons. I'm not convinced that any African state is strong enough, as you were talking about at the beginning of this conversation, to actually implement China's vision of the world without literally ceding control to China to manage those countries for us. And I'm not sure that African citizens will be happy with that trade-off, even if they are happy with that way of managing their lives. I think that there is an appetite for Africa being run by and ruled by Africa rather than by another global power. So what do you think there? Is there an opportunity, or is that just simply a pipe dream? We simply do not have the financial resources or political cohesion to present the world with a third way.
So right now, I think we face three big challenges: debt, disease, and dysfunction. And I think until and unless we can get a handle on those, we're going to be dependent on external parties. And I think that's fundamentally the issue that we have, is this cycle of dependency. We can see it in our economics, where kind of countries like Nigeria that produce crude oil are importing the refined product. We've got this perpetual dependency on external parties for funding, for trade relationships, for investment. And I think that needs to change. Now, of course, that is going to be very contingent on leadership. And at the moment, the type of leadership that we have is really not fit for purpose. So, we have a demographic disconnect that's about 40 years between those that are leading and those that they are leading. People are being governed by their grandparents, grandfathers in most cases. We've got very few women leaders as well. And so, leadership that is more inclusive, that is more in touch with the needs of the youth, and that is, I guess, more cognizant of the fact that you can do well and you can do good simultaneously, and that the economic model needs to shift fundamentally from being about kind of purely this kind of very closed patronage kind of political elite setup to a more inclusive one. I think is going to be quite important, because otherwise we're facing a ticking time bomb. And we've seen it play out in various countries, from Egypt to Algeria to Burkina Faso. When people have had enough, they've had enough, and it kind of once the match is lit, then things erupt. And I think, that the inequality mix that we've got on the continent at the moment is not sustainable. So we need radically different solutions, which is to my point about smart cuts, about how we hack the ladder to success. So I think it's really going to be contingent upon the leadership that we have. I think a far more confident, assertive, muscular African leadership that kind of is not intimidated by or doesn't cower to kind of what global powers kind of dictate to it is very, very important. And I've had various discussions with people who suggest that actually the continent needs to be quite militant and quite aggressive in understanding what it wants and how it goes for that, because otherwise it's going to forever be dictated to by external powers. So I think definitely African agency is very important. I think setting our values and our vision for the future is critical. I think we cannot afford to neglect external partners. There's a role for each of them. But I think, to be quite honest, the Continental Free Trade Agreement represents the most practical, pragmatic, and real kind of blueprint that we've got of kind of creating an African continent that is shaped by Africans. There's political momentum, there's African agency. It is aspirational, but if we adopt an incremental approach, I think it gives us something to work towards. So I don't think we should overcomplicate this with kind of grand visions and designs. It really requires kind of a back to basics approach where we're solving for the basics. And then kind of moving towards greater regional integration and then continental integration, which then allows us to kind of to play a far more compelling role in global power dynamics.
Yeah, I think it's a very good point. And it has to be pragmatic and start with the basics, like you say. But I think there's one other challenge that we haven't really spoken about that's perhaps a kind of elephant in the room, and that's the fact that the sort of plans that you're talking about and the sort of negotiating for global power requires a long-term view which is really outside of the scope of those sort of geriatric politicians that we were speaking about earlier's lifespan. And we've seen this in South Africa, we've seen this across the continent, where a sort of first generation of sort of free politicians, they're the new dispensations, sort of hang on to power until essentially they are either forced out of office or they age out of office. And they are focused, due to the incentives of the way these sort of political systems have been set up, to focus on short term, to focus on populist dispensations and giving things to populations to keep them popular, to keep them within power, all in the short term. And all of this sort of short term power negotiation is at the detriment for Africa as a whole and African nations as individual nations for building long-term power and long-term negotiating chips to deal with the rest of the world. That's a very big sort of trade-off we're having to deal with, this difference between short-termism and short-term thinking and getting what we need right now, because Africa is a continent that deals with a lot more real problems. So we have more problems today than perhaps other nations would have. So it's not an unfair observation. There's legitimate reasons for short-termism too. But in order to become a global power, in order for something like the African Free Trade Agreement to work on a global level, not just on a local level, it requires long-term thinking. And I'm just not convinced that there are any incentives or carrots or sticks aligned with getting African leadership to think about that long now. And that becomes a source of huge disadvantage when essentially, like I was speaking about earlier, your closest competitors are the countries that are sort of closest to you on the sort of macro geopolitical life cycles. And they would be your countries like India and like China, of course. And China does have a long-term vision. China has a long-term plan, and it has a culture that is instilled in their populations from very, very young ages towards working towards the long-term greater good of the Chinese nation state, or actually basically empire at this point. So how can Africa compete with that when we are constantly dealing with short-term crises on the one hand? On the other hand, we've got a fragmented leadership that is all really based, as you were speaking about earlier, on the sort of politics of the stomach. Unfortunately, there's not too many examples to the contrary that we can point to, even if we do want to be charitable to the current leadership that we have distributed in the world around us right now. What is your comment on that? And what are perhaps some short-term steps that we can do to sort of point us towards playing a longer game? Because if we're not playing a longer game, we're going to lose the long game, even if we feel like we're winning in the short term with our new bridges and our new bailouts, or whatever the case is that we are shooting for.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're quite right. There's this tension between kind of, the domestic kind of sovereignty and nationalist impulses that you're seeing in many countries on the continent, and then this kind of longer term aspirational vision. And there's that disconnect, because on the one hand, you're asking countries to kind of cede sovereignty and forget about their domestic 4-year election cycles for the greater good. But, in a context where everything is about short-term populism, that's a very difficult sell. And I think we're seeing that in various instances across the continent. When we look at the Continental Free Trade Agreement, Kenya negotiating a bilateral trade deal with the US, for example, friction between Nigeria and South Africa around xenophobia, border disputes between Nigeria and Benin, Tanzania and Zambia. All of these kind of protectionist impulses and this "my country first" kind of sentiment, which is playing out, does threaten to compromise this broader vision. I think, ultimately the penny needs to drop, and that is again going to depend on the quality of leadership that we have, because ultimately, we are not in a sustainable situation. So this kind of short-termism, short-term thinking eventually catches up. When the poor have nothing to eat, they eat the rich. And unfortunately, we are in a situation where we're sleepwalking to crisis, and we're going to squander the demographic dividend unless something drastic happens. Again, I bring it back to the Continental Free Trade Agreement, because that does present us with some kind of vision and articulated roadmap for the future. And I think in addition to the protectionist and nationalist versus kind of Pan-African tension that you've also got two further tensions, which is around the kind of bigger and smaller states on the continent. And you want to avoid a kind of EU style situation between a Germany and a Greece, where the benefits are not equally shared. The more vulnerable nations are given adequate protection to make sure that they buy into this kind of grand vision, and it's not just a collective of the big nations reaping the benefits, because that actually threatens to make things a lot worse than they currently are, and to exacerbate the divisions. And then the third kind of tension that needs to be resolved is between kind of the technocrats and the political elites and the average man or woman on the street. Because often that's at odds. We've got this lovely agreement that's been signed in Kigali, and that that's being brokered by the technocrats in the African Union. But in terms of the kind of day-to-day impact on the man on the street, if you ask kind of someone to take a short-term hit for the greater good when people are living below the breadline, it's going to be quite a difficult sell. So there needs to be a kind of I think those for me are the three tensions that are going to need to be resolved in terms of making the Continental Free Trade Agreement a reality. But I think, as I've mentioned in the past as well, how the state is able to interface with the relationship between the state and its citizens, non-state actors, the business community, international creditors, and international powers, navigating those relationships is going to determine how successful we are or not.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. But we have spoken quite a lot about the requirement for political leadership in Africa to step up to the plate, because without their buy-in, without their actual buying into this long-term vision, and to sacrificing some things in the short term for a longer term, stronger continent and stronger nation state too, we're really not going to be getting very far very fast with something like the African Free Trade Agreement. However, there's probably also something we need to speak about around the role of capital in this whole situation, and not just local capital, but international capital to So we spoke briefly about how Africa can sort of, show its ankle to the global investors to get a bit of a capital attracted towards us. But there's also a role for national and for local capital to get involved here. Is there not? Particularly since we are dealing with really weak states that are reliant on corporate interests and on taxpayers buying into these things too. So at the one hand, you've got to sort of change the mindsets of the very few, very elderly guys at the top. At the other hand, you've also got to get buy-in from the people that are essentially funding these state projects at the moment. And in an African context, that sort of funder class is not a majority like it is in developed parts of the world, where more people than not are net taxpayers. In countries like South Africa, and the same issues do take place across many places across Africa, you've really got very few hands that are controlling the levers of capital, and they hold outsized power for that same reason. I mean, we know this. We've got a very small tax-paying class. We've got a very few corporations that employ most of the people, that pay most of the corporate tax. How do we get that capital class of interests aligned to these agendas too? Because we can talk about this as much as we like. There's also going to be a sacrifice that is required and a compromise and a trade-off required for that group of power too. So both the sort of economic powers in Africa and the political powers in Africa have to align and have to compromise. So what are your thoughts there of how to get buy-in from a class of entities that is really incentivized purely by profit margin at the end of the day? I mean, this is how capital markets work. Or does Africa have to forget about capitalism altogether, which is something we kind of alluded to earlier? But over to you.
So I think this is really interesting, because I think domestic solutions to domestic problems, I think, is something that is really undercooked on the continent. And the case in point here is around domestic capital markets. If you look at some of our biggest challenges on the continent, they're infrastructure based. Now, if you're borrowing in foreign currency and your economic model is based on boom bust scenarios, you're constantly faced with timing mismatches, and you're constantly faced with currency mismatches, which doesn't lead to a sustainable state of affairs. Then you also look at kind of domestic banking sectors who are not lending into the real economy because they're simply taking deposits and putting them in treasury bills, which are kind of giving you very attractive rates north of 15%. They're not doing what they're supposed to do. So, you've got this situation where you don't have a domestic pool of capital. And if you kind of can develop that, you can deal with things of infrastructure, you can lend into the real economy, you can stimulate economic activity. So I think, domestic solutions are critically important, and that requires really a lot of political will. Because if you look at our dependency on external funding, we've got the IMF, we've got China, we've got bilateral and concessional loans, and we've got international financial markets. Each of these have a carrot and a stick. But I think reducing this dependency will then allow us to become more autonomous, more self-sufficient, and less dependent on the vagaries of what happens in the global economy. So I think developing those domestic solutions are critical. I think also, and this is something that we've written about together, I think using our domestic human capital and physical resources effectively is important. And the technicolor economy, which looks at the green economy, the blue economy, the purple economy, which is the cultural economy, the flat white digital economy, and the gray economy, which is the informal economy. These are all underdeveloped sectors which have huge potential, which fall very nicely into what the Continental Free Trade Agreement is trying to achieve. And I think these are underdeveloped and underexplored. So, I guess the core message is that this needs to be we need to look inward for these local solutions, because we're not going to get any help from the external environment.
Well, exactly. If we're not prepared to invest in ourselves, why should anyone else be? If we're not prepared to take on that sort of risk, we have to expect to be exploited by various different worldviews that all offer different trade-offs, but won't be acting in our own best interests. So it really is a case of we all have to kind of step up to the plate. So to close off with, Ronak, what advice could you give to people that are listening to this, that happen to listen to this conversation? Ordinary citizens, ordinary consumers, ordinary business people who are watching this. Is there anything in particular that they can do to invest in a a win-win future for Africa? Do you have any advice for individuals, or is this a case of we really are at the mercy of our politicians and we better be voting for better hands to guide us if we want to get better results going forward? What are your closing comments there?
Yeah, so I think this is a complicated continent. We're at a very complicated point in time, and the pandemic has really exposed a lot of our weaknesses. But I think this creates opportunity as well. I think the extent of the challenges is such that we can't. The state is important, but it's not the be all and end all of everything. The role of the private sector is critically important, and civil society as well. I think the ability to kind of create transformative change, to do well and to do good on the continent is unrivaled. But I think we really do need to be smart about the way we approach it. And that starts, I think, with understanding the nuances and the complexities of the continent, understanding what's going on both internally and externally, and having a really kind of sophisticated, nuanced view around country-specific dynamics as well. I think it's quite easy to kind of be very risk averse towards the continent because it's complicated, it's messy, and there's kind of lots of commotion all the time. But I think with the kind of right homework, the right due diligence, with the right partnerships, there's significant opportunity. And I think quite simply put, the continent is going to be too big to ignore. From an investment perspective, 1 in 4 people in the world by 2050 are going to be African. So, whether we like it or not, it's going to play a fundamental role in the global political economy going forward. So, I think the concluding message is ignore Africa at your peril.
Excellent advice. So where can people find you if they want to unpack some of these ideas in a bit more detail, read more of your work?
I'm on LinkedIn and Twitter, usually giving too many opinions, so you can find me over there.
Don't ask him about the Black Forest cake, right? Anyway, thank you so much for joining us on The Small Prints.
Thanks for having me.